How does a 39-year-old man feel knowing he has less than 24 hours to live? Not because of illness, not because of war, but because the state of Texas has marked the date and time they plan to kill him. Charles Anthony Boyd, a man who once walked the streets with hopes, desires, and ambitions, now faces his final moments, an existence reduced to a mere countdown. He stands at the edge of an irrevocable fate, the ticking clock echoing in the silence of his cell. What runs through his mind? Is it fear, regret, or the haunting question of what could have been if life had unfolded differently? In these last hours, Boyd's life, his choices, and the cruel finality of justice converge. He is not a nameless figure, but a man with a history, a man who murdered, who lied, who confessed. Yet, in these moments before his execution, Boyd is also a man reduced to his essence, facing the ultimate judgment. As the state prepares to end his life, we must ask ourselves, can we truly understand the emotional landscape of someone who is about to die at the hands of the system? Tonight, the world will be reminded of the cost of justice, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the lingering question, what do we truly seek when we sentence someone to death? On July 22, 1986, Charles Anthony Boyd committed his first murder, a brutal act that would set in motion a series of events that would change not only his life, but the lives of others forever. Boyd, a man with a troubled past, had already tasted the bitterness of prison life, serving time for sexual assault and burglary. His release from prison in 1985 seemed like a second chance, a new beginning. But as we often see, the cycle of violence does not simply fade away. Tipawan Nakusan, a 37-year-old Thai immigrant working as a waitress, was Boyd's first victim. She lived in an apartment above Boyd's, an ordinary woman leading an ordinary life. But on that fateful night, her life ended violently. She was found in her bathtub, stabbed and suffocated, the circumstances of her death as cold as the water that had filled the tub. In September of that same year, Boyd struck again. This time the victim was 22-year-old LaShun Chappelle, an apartment cleaning lady who had no idea the monster living among her neighbors would soon end her life. Chappelle was found dead in her apartment bathroom, similarly stabbed to death, a chilling echo of the previous murder. The brutality of the crime was undeniable. Boyd's dark tendencies were becoming clear. Each victim was another link in a chain of destruction he seemed unable to break. By the time Boyd committed his third murder, the pattern was undeniable. On April 13, 1987, Boyd killed 21-year-old Mary Milligan. This murder was marked by similar violence, but this time, Boyd didn't just take a life. He also stole a car, further connecting the dots in a pattern of violent acts that could not be ignored. Mary's body was discovered stuffed into a bathtub, raped, strangled, and drowned. The scene was horrific, the brutality more horrifying than the previous murders. Investigators, piecing together the puzzle, began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer, a man who was hunting, methodically, one victim at a time. The media had already dubbed the killings the bathroom slayings, a label that would haunt Boyd as the investigation progressed. There was a growing sense of unease in North Dallas as police worked tirelessly to find the killer behind these heinous acts. The break in the case came when Boyd attempted to pawn off several of Milligan's personal items. This moment, seemingly insignificant, would lead to his arrest and ultimately to the truth about his crimes. Boyd was arrested on April 14, 1987, and confessed to the murders of Nakusan, Chappell, and Milligan. At first glance, Boyd's confessions seemed to confirm his guilt, but behind the confession was a story of a man struggling with his mental state, trying to reconcile with the violence he had inflicted. Boyd's defense team would later argue that his low IQ, a critical detail in his life, should have been considered when determining his culpability. But at that moment, all that mattered was the fact that 3 lives had been lost, and Boyd was the one responsible. Boyd's actions were not just random acts of violence, They were the culmination of years of struggles, mental health issues, and choices that had led him to this point. But as we explore the details of his crimes, we must remember that his actions, no matter how incomprehensible, left an indelible mark on the victims' families, and Boyd's story cannot be separated from the lives he destroyed. The path to Boyd's conviction was complicated, filled with legal battles and arguments about his mental state. But in the end, there was no denying the fact that Boyd had killed, and for that, the consequences would be severe. In the aftermath of Boyd's arrest, a sense of both relief and dread swept through North Dallas. The public had been on edge, haunted by the brutality of the murders, while the families of the victims were left to grieve the loss of their loved ones. But for Boyd, the terror was just beginning. His arrest, while bringing an end to the immediate threat, was only the beginning of a long and tumultuous legal battle. The investigation that followed Boyd's capture was exhaustive. Law enforcement quickly connected the dots between the three murders, uncovering a pattern of violence that left no room for doubt. Charles Boyd was a serial killer. The media dubbed him the Bathroom Slayer, a title that would forever be linked to his name. In the face of overwhelming evidence, Boyd confessed to the murders, but the road to conviction was not as straightforward as it seemed. Boyd's defense attorneys sought to cast doubt on the integrity of the confessions. They argued that Boyd's confession had been coerced, suggesting that his low IQ, measured at 67, may have impaired his ability to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. At the time, Boyd had served time in prison for sexual assault and burglary, and his history was marked by legal and mental health struggles. His defense attorneys leaned heavily on these factors, attempting to paint Boyd as a man who had been failed by the system, a man who was mentally incapable of understanding the gravity of the crimes he committed. But Boyd's confession, along with forensic evidence from the crime scenes, was damning. The physical evidence was irrefutable. Boyd's blood was found at the scene of the murders, and DNA testing linked him to the crimes. Yet, even as these pieces of evidence painted a clear picture of his guilt, Boyd's defense team focused on the possibility that his mental state had been a significant factor in his actions. Boyd's trial, which began in October 1987, was a complex and emotional affair. The prosecution pushed for the death penalty, arguing that Boyd's violent actions were premeditated and showed a pattern of escalation. They painted Boyd as a dangerous individual, one whose capacity for violence was evident in the brutality of his crimes. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Boyd's mental retardation should mitigate the severity of his punishment. They presented testimony from mental health experts who claimed Boyd's intellectual disability had played a significant role in his actions, claiming that Boyd was not fully aware of the consequences of his decisions. The jury deliberated for only 10 minutes before reaching a guilty verdict. Boyd was convicted of capital murder, and his fate was sealed with a death sentence. The jury's decision to impose the death penalty reflected the severity of the crimes, but it also ignited a debate about Boyd's mental state, his history of mental health issues, and whether he deserved the ultimate punishment. The issue of mental retardation was one of the most contentious aspects of the trial. Boyd's defense team argued that his IQ of 67, a score below the threshold of 70, should have been considered as a significant mitigating factor. But the prosecution countered with evidence suggesting that Boyd's intellectual disability was not as severe as his defense team claimed, pointing to prison records that indicated Boyd had an IQ of 80. This legal back and forth would continue for years, with Boyd's defense team filing appeals in an effort to overturn his conviction and avoid the death penalty. In 1992, Boyd filed a federal habeas petition, claiming ineffective assistance of counsel and the unconstitutional sentencing scheme in his trial. His attorneys argued that his defense team had failed to properly present evidence of his mental retardation, which could have potentially spared him from the death sentence. But the courts, in a series of rulings, rejected these appeals, ultimately denying Boyd the opportunity for a new trial. As the legal battle stretched on, Boyd's fate remained uncertain. With each failed appeal, the reality of his execution grew closer. By the time Boyd's death sentence was carried out in August 1999, the legal system had done its work, but Boyd's case continued to stir controversy. The question remained: was Boyd a man who had been lost to his own mental struggles, or was he a cold-blooded killer deserving of the ultimate punishment? The legal aftermath of Boyd's conviction painted a complex picture, one of mental health, intellectual disability, and the blurred lines between justice and mercy. Boyd's case became a symbol of the broader issues surrounding the death penalty, particularly in cases where the mental state of the defendant is in question. And as Boyd sat in his cell, waiting for the end, the legal system's failure to fully address these concerns seemed a tragic reminder of the complexities of justice. As Charles Boyd's appeals were systematically rejected and the clock ticked closer to his execution date, a profound and deeply emotional struggle took place. For Boyd, the final years before his death were not just filled with legal battles. They were marked by a desperate attempt to make sense of the life he had led and the horrors he had inflicted. Behind the prison walls, Boyd wrestled with his identity, his guilt, and the chilling reality of the punishment that awaited him. But as the days dwindled down, his struggle was not just internal. It was a battle with the very concept of justice. The death penalty was always an inherent part of Boyd's case, an inevitable consequence of his crimes. But his defense team continued to push for a reconsideration of his sentence, emphasizing his mental limitations and the complex nature of his past. Boyd had been raised in a broken system, one that failed to address his mental health issues and the signs of his developmental struggles. For years, his attorneys argued that Boyd's intellectual disability made him less culpable for his actions, but these pleas fell on deaf ears. The court, once convinced of Boyd's guilt, was unwilling to reconsider the full implications of his mental state in the light of his death sentence. This struggle wasn't just about law. It was about the very humanity of a man who had been marked for death. Boyd's defense argued that the death penalty was a cruel and unusual punishment for someone who had been mentally impaired, drawing from the landmark Atkins v. Virginia case, which ruled that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violated the Eighth Amendment. Yet, Boyd's case was not heard within the context of this new decision. The Texas legal system remained steadfast in its stance, refusing to allow Boyd's mental retardation to sway the course of his punishment. For Boyd, each failed appeal was a painful reminder of his isolation, not just from society, but also from any hope for redemption. His attorneys, while advocating on his behalf, faced their own challenges in the face of a system that seemed uninterested in the nuances of his case. The emotional toll of these repeated failures weighed heavily on all involved. Boyd's supporters were forced to confront a bitter truth. The system that was designed to seek justice was often a cold, mechanical process, one that failed to account for the humanity of the individual at the center of it all. Boyd's emotional state deteriorated as the date of his execution loomed closer. He became more withdrawn, less communicative, and deeply reflective of his past actions. He spoke little in his final days, but the few words he did offer were a mixture of defiance and regret. The man who once confessed to the murders with a sense of finality was now uncertain of his own legacy. Was he a man who had murdered and deserved to die? Or was he a victim of his circumstances, a product of a world that had failed him? In the hours leading up to his execution, Boyd's final moments were marked by an emotional conflict that had been simmering throughout his time on death row. His refusal to acknowledge guilt, the insistence on his innocence in his last words, seemed to reveal a man not fully at peace with the life he had led, or the fate that was about to unfold. His claim of innocence, asserting that a DNA test could reveal the true identity of the murderer, was an attempt to carve out a shred of hope, even as the lethal injection loomed. Boyd's last stand, however brief and ultimately futile, was a desperate cry for a second chance, not just for himself, but for those who shared his experience. The struggle over the death penalty, over whether Boyd was a mentally impaired man deserving of mercy or a violent criminal deserving of execution, became a microcosm of the broader debate about capital punishment and its place in a society that claims to value justice. His execution by lethal injection on August 5, 1999, was the tragic culmination of this long legal battle, a battle that failed to reconsider his mental state, his remorse, or the possibility of rehabilitation. Boyd's story was no longer just about the crimes he had committed, but about the death penalty itself, its efficacy, its fairness, and its cost. The state of Texas, having sealed Boyd's fate, had also sealed its own role in a larger, more complex question about justice and redemption. As Charles Boyd faced the final days of his life, a profound question lingered. Could redemption be possible for a man who had committed such atrocities? Could a person like Boyd, who had lived a life marked by violence, mental health struggles, and a system that had failed him, ever find a way to grow, to change, or even to atone for his actions? In the prison system, where Boyd spent the majority of his final years, there were moments that suggested a faint flicker of growth. For the condemned, prison is not just a place of punishment. It is also a place where individuals are often left to confront their own demons. Some prisoners find solace in religion, others in introspection. But for Boyd, the prospect of true personal change was limited by his circumstances. His life had been defined by violence, and now it seemed that even the chance for growth had been taken away from him. In the years leading up to his execution, Boyd's behavior fluctuated. He had moments where he appeared remorseful, acknowledging the horror of his actions, even as he remained adamant about his innocence in the final hours. But his attempts at redemption were tempered by the stark reality that, for many, it was too late to change perceptions of him as a violent criminal. Boyd's defense team had fought for years to bring attention to his mental limitations, his childhood traumas, and the history of abuse and neglect that had played a role in shaping his violent tendencies. But the system, focused solely on the crime and punishment, could not look beyond the man who had committed the murders. However, within the prison system, Boyd was not entirely without guidance. There were guards, counselors, and even some fellow inmates who, in the years before his execution, attempted to offer him a path to something better. Some saw him as a victim of a broken system, a product of an upbringing that never gave him the tools to build a life beyond the streets of North Dallas. These individuals, though limited in their ability to intervene, tried to guide Boyd toward introspection. They encouraged him to accept responsibility for his actions, not as a way to absolve him of guilt, but as a step toward understanding the full scope of his actions, and perhaps seeking a form of redemption, even if it came too late. Boyd's most significant mentor during this time was a prison chaplain who attempted to help him find peace in his final days. This chaplain, who had spent years working with death row inmates, spoke of the importance of faith, repentance, and the human capacity for change, even in the darkest moments. Boyd, though skeptical at times, listened. He did not embrace religion in the way some might have hoped, but there were moments in his final days when he spoke with a quiet humility. He expressed sorrow, not only for the victims of his crimes, but for his own lost opportunities. Boyd's reflections seemed to indicate a man coming to terms with the reality of his actions and the irreversible nature of his fate. He knew he was not going to be granted another chance. Yet, despite these moments of introspection, Boyd's path to redemption seemed hindered by the finality of his situation. How could he reconcile with a world that was about to take his life? Could he truly understand the depths of his actions in a meaningful way before the lethal injection took his breath away? In his final hours, Boyd's efforts toward growth and reflection felt like an incomplete journey, one that would never fully reach its destination. In a sense, Boyd's story became a tragic reflection of the human condition itself, imperfect, broken, and often stunted by forces beyond an individual's control. Boyd's attempts at redemption were not enough to undo the harm he had caused, and no amount of self-reflection or mentorship could take away the lives he had ended. And yet, his struggle to find meaning in the face of death, a struggle that many condemned prisoners share, raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the possibilities for growth, even when the odds are stacked so heavily against someone's chance for change. As Boyd's execution date drew closer, the question of mentorship and growth seemed almost irrelevant. The system had already decided his fate. There was no time left for the kind of transformation that would have truly made a difference. His story became not just about the crimes he committed, but about the lost potential of a life that had ended before it had a chance to truly evolve. Boyd's final moments were not just about death. They were about the complexity of the human soul and the tragic limitations placed on redemption within a system that values punishment over personal growth. The day arrived. The final day in a life that had been defined by tragedy, violence, and a series of irreversible decisions. Charles Anthony Boyd, 39 years old, stood on the precipice of his execution. It was August 5, 1999, 12 days shy of his 40th birthday. As the hours ticked down, Boyd's thoughts were unclear, fragmented by years of legal battles, failed appeals, and the ultimate finality of his situation. This was the moment that would end it all, the culmination of a decade-long saga of murder, imprisonment, and the death penalty that Boyd had come to understand would be his fate. Boyd had already spent years on death row, but the finality of the moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. As the minutes drew near, he was led to the execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit in Texas, a place where so many others had met the same cruel fate. In the quiet of his cell, Boyd had tried to make peace with himself, to find some form of understanding or redemption. But now, standing at the threshold of death, all that remained was the reality of the lethal injection waiting to claim his life. His final moments were marked by a chilling calmness. He had declined to make a final statement, a decision that many found deeply unsettling, given the emotional weight of the situation. The man who had once confessed to his crimes, the man who had stood trial, now stood silent. His refusal to speak was a stark contrast to the expected rituals of the death penalty, where most inmates would offer some last words, a prayer, a plea for forgiveness, or perhaps a defiant statement of innocence. As the drugs were administered, Boyd's body reacted in a manner that echoed the finality of his fate. His chest heaved as the sedatives took effect, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was going to speak. Perhaps to deny the truth of the crimes once more. Perhaps to offer some kind of final reckoning. But the words never came. Instead, Boyd's body went still. His breathing slowed, and then he gasped, an involuntary reflex that reverberated through the room before silence took over. "I want you all to know I did not do this crime." Boyd's voice had rasped in his final breaths, his last words an attempt to hold on to some semblance of innocence, even as the life drained from him. "I wanted to wait for a 30-day stay for a DNA test so you know who did the crime." His words, filled with an echo of denial, were a desperate attempt to reclaim something that had long since been lost. His chance at proving innocence, his opportunity to make the truth his final statement. But as his words faded, Boyd's fight against his fate ended. His eyes closed and his breathing ceased. The execution was over. He was pronounced dead at 6:16 p.m., his life extinguished in a process that many consider a form of justice, but to others, a reminder of the system's harshness. Boyd's final moments were not those of an innocent man standing before an unjust death. Nor were they those of a cold-blooded murderer accepting the inevitable end. Instead, they were the moments of a man caught in the painful, conflicting turmoil of his past actions and the finality of the system that had sentenced him. Boyd's refusal to speak, his denial, and his claim of innocence all came at the cost of understanding the full weight of his crimes. It was a desperate cry to rewrite a history that could not be undone. In the end, Boyd's execution was not just a tragic event. It was a reflection of the brokenness of a system that had failed him at nearly every turn. Boyd's final moments encapsulated not just his own journey, but the larger moral questions about justice, death, and the possibility of redemption. As he took his last breath, it was clear that Boyd's story would not be one of ultimate resolution, but one of incompleteness. A life, a death, and an entire system left fractured and unresolved. When the needle entered Charles Boyd's arm and his life came to a halt, the world around him moved forward, indifferent to his final breath. His execution, like so many others, was a stark punctuation mark on a long and tumultuous legal and social narrative. Yet, for those left behind, his victims' families, the broader community, and even Boyd's own family, the impact was far from over. The consequences of Boyd's life, his crimes, and his death would reverberate long after his final moments. For the families of Tipawan Nakusan, LaShun Chappell, and Mary Milligan, Boyd's execution did little to heal the wounds left by their loved ones' brutal murders. The criminal justice system, while efficient in ending Boyd's life, could not undo the suffering these families endured. No finality, no execution, could bring back the lives lost. For the victims' families, the death of the man responsible for their pain was not a victory. It was simply the end of a long, painful chapter in their own lives. Boyd's death did not erase their grief, nor did it return what was taken from them. In many ways, it only marked the tragic acknowledgement that no form of justice could truly provide closure. The public, too, had its own response to Boyd's execution. While there were those who viewed it as a necessary act, a response to the violence he had caused, there were others who saw Boyd's death as a failure of the system, an indictment of the justice process that, for all its finality, was not without its flaws. Boyd's case had raised uncomfortable questions about mental health, about the effectiveness of the death penalty, and about the ethical implications of a system that exacted retribution rather than rehabilitation. His execution was, to many, a sobering reminder of the complexities of justice and the cost of capital punishment, especially when dealing with individuals whose mental capacity was in question. In particular, Boyd's mental state had been a topic of extensive legal debate. His defense team had argued for years that Boyd's borderline intellectual disability, with an IQ measured as low as 64, should be taken into account in sentencing. Yet, Boyd's execution was carried out despite these concerns, raising questions about the fairness of applying the death penalty in such cases. Was Boyd truly deserving of the ultimate punishment? Or had the system failed him by not adequately considering the role of his mental limitations in his crimes? Even Boyd's family was left to grapple with the aftermath of his death. For them, Boyd was more than just the murderer he had become in the public eye. He was a son, a brother, a man who had been shaped by his past in ways that few could fully comprehend. His family's loss was layered with grief, not just for the death of Boyd himself, but for the tragedies of his life, the failures of a system that had not intervened earlier, and the sorrow of knowing that their loved one was beyond redemption in the eyes of the law. Boyd's family would forever carry the weight of both the man he had been and the man he had become, caught between the brutality of his crimes and the humanity of his origins. From a broader societal perspective, Boyd's execution was yet another reminder of the divisiveness of the death penalty debate. While some saw it as a necessary form of justice for those who committed heinous acts, Others questioned whether it was truly a humane or effective solution. Boyd's case did not answer these questions, but it highlighted the fundamental flaws in a system that often leaves little room for nuance or empathy. The process that led to Boyd's execution, marked by legal maneuverings, appeals, and counter-arguments, was an unsentimental reflection of a society grappling with its own ideals of justice, retribution, and morality. In the end, Boyd's death did not offer a definitive answer to the questions raised by his crime and his life. The system had fulfilled its role in punishing him, but the emotional and moral implications of his execution continued to linger. What Boyd's story exemplified was not a clear-cut case of justice, but a series of tragic events that forced society to reckon with its own limitations in the pursuit of fairness. The impact of Boyd's death was, and remains, a deeply complex and personal matter, one that transcends legal debates and touches on the very heart of the human experience. His life, his crimes, and his execution will always be part of the larger story of how justice is administered, how society defines right from wrong, and how we as humans navigate the complicated waters of redemption and retribution. The file on Charles Anthony Boyd is officially closed, but this investigation is far from over. We know that, for every case that gets a final headline, there are thousands that go cold. Is there a case that's always bothered you? Maybe it's that one local mystery that never got solved. Or maybe it's a headline you saw from across the country, a case that just disappeared from the news, where the official story just doesn't add up. This is where you come in. Comment below with the one case, from any time, any place, that you believe the authorities got wrong or swept under the rug. We read every single comment, and your case might be the one we investigate next, uncovering the details they don't want you to know. But we can't do it without you. If you want us to investigate the cases that really matter, you have to do your part. Subscribe and hit that notification bell. Like this video. Share this with everyone you know who's tired of easy answers. Don't just watch the news. Help us decide what to uncover. We'll see you in the comments.